and meet echo. So let me actually do a presentation of the chair slides from the data tracker then. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Didn't actually do the audio test before.
I can hear you.
Excellent. My co-chair Jen will not be joining me today for this because the timing here was designed to be decent for people from the East Coast, just decent for people from the East Coast or the West Coast of the US into Europe, and she's in Sydney, so the time zones are kind of brutal. I'll wait another minute or so for people to come in while I pull the slides off the data tracker. And Corian, are you prepared to present from your machine? Usually there's like a preloaded slides thing, but those somehow did not get preloaded. So material.
I can present from my screen, yes.
Okay, good. Let me pull these up. And then yes, window, this one, share. So, hello everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Pathware Networking Research Group. I am Brian Dremel, one of your two co-chairs. As I said, Jen will not make it today due to fun with time zones. This is a meeting of an IRTF research group, and therefore is subject to the IRTF note well. The IRTF follows the IETF Intellectual Property Right Disclosure Rules. If you are not familiar with them, please do review them before saying anything at the microphone or making another contribution to this meeting. All of the contributions to this meeting are subject to the rules set out in 5743, 5378, 8179, etc. Note also well that the IETF Code of Conduct and Anti-Harassment Procedures apply to the IRTF and therefore to this meeting. Given that, here is our agenda today. We basically have 4 points on the agenda and one presentation. I expect today to be mainly a Q&A / discussion meeting. There will be a, we'll start off with an overview of Scion, which is also drawn from Draft IETF-PANRG Scion overview. And then we're going to have a bit of Q&A and general discussion, sort of like especially focused on Scion and the questions raised in RFC 9217, and then a bit of discussion about next steps. So I've like very liberally put time in the agenda for those two, like 30 minutes, but like basically we're hoping that there will be discussion that'll go on and then we'll naturally fall into the next steps part of that. Why are we here? What is the purpose of this meeting? So there was a Scion side meeting at IETF 113 in Vienna. So this presented Scion. It's an internet architecture that addresses many of the research questions that are raised in the research group. So we thought it would actually be a pretty good opportunity for the proponents from that side meeting to come and have a discussion about Scion as a whole as a research group topic. And then we want to talk a little bit. So that second part of the agenda is how the research group might be a conduit toward bringing Scion or parts of it into the IETF, or what parts of that work might it make sense to do within the research group, right? Like, so there's a bunch of questions and next steps that we'll bring up on the next slide. But first, we are going to hear from Corian and the Scion team. So let's see if you could put yourself back in the queue to pass slides control. All the slots for requested media are already taken. Grant screen. There we go. Hold on. Do I have to stop sharing the screen first? Let me stop screen share and then I can grant screen.
Yes. So I have to, let's see.
So you should grant a screen share and then you can select the window that you want to show.
Yeah, I think Do you see something?
I see you and I see me.
Yeah. So maybe can you? Oh wait, I have to ask it again because I think I clicked something wrong.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Grant screen.
Share.
Nope, that didn't work.
Permission denied.
Oh, your browser might not have permission to send information from your screen. Okay. No worries. You can just tell me to do next screen, next slide, next slide, next slide.
Okay,
and
good.
I can do that then. So
okay, that's okay. Let's do that. Yes.
Loading.
You should probably be able to share the pre-uploaded slides as well.
I uploaded the slides, but I'm not showing any pre-shared slides in. There are no slides available.
If you go into settings, you can probably tell it to convert them.
Say again?
In the top right corner, there is a little toolkit.
Settings. Manage slides. Okay.
Yes.
Import this deck. Import this deck. I'm sorry. I thought that was already done. Okay. Now you can, or here, well, just to save some time, I will share preloaded slides. And you can just let me know when I'm supposed to click the thing.
And you can also hand over the controls to her if you want.
Oh, then I can hand over controls. Yes.
Just click on go in.
Pass slides control. Ooh, neat.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much, Karsten.
Okay, thank you. So now I just have to click. I see it already.
Yeah.
I can, yes, okay, thank you. Okay, hello, everybody. Welcome to this meeting. And Brian, thank you for organizing this meeting and also inviting us to the meeting. This meeting serves for us to discuss how to proceed also a little bit with Scion and the standardization process of it. As input for this meeting, we have already submitted an internet draft, informational internet draft, for which I sent you, or at least the PANRG mailing list, I sent the link. And yes, I hope, of course, that you have read the draft. So now I go to the next slide. With this presentation, we first want to provide some background to Scion, the draft, and also to the authors of the draft. And for those people who didn't find the time to read our informational internet draft, we will briefly describe what Scion is about. Then I want to tell you shortly why we think this time, the time is ripe to bring Scion to the IETF and to maybe start this standardization process. And then, of course, we would like to show you what we think for us are the next steps. But of course, this in the end depends on your feedback and comments during this meeting on the draft, on Scion in general, and also on Scion in the context of the PANRG and IETF. So I first shortly want to introduce the authors of the informational internet draft we submitted. First, me, I'm a technical writing who is in charge of writing the standardization documents on Scion. I'm Corine de Kater. I'm from Holland. And then the second author is Nicola Rustignoli. He is in charge of the Scion technical outreach efforts and also supports the Scion certification and standardization processes. We both have a Masters of Technical University and several years of experience for working for IT companies. And the third person is Adrian Perk. He's a professor of computer science at the ETH Zurich, and he has been developed, or he's in Scion over the last 12 years. The three of us are affiliated with the Scion Association, and this Scion Association is currently in the process of being founded or launched. This is a non-profit organization bridging the gap between academia and industry. Another purpose is to promote the global Scion adoption and also to maintain and expand the Scion open source code base. And Scion itself is a interdomain, path-aware, next-generation architecture. The word Scion stands for scalability, control, and isolation on next generation networks. It offers securability and availability by design, and it provides root control, failure isolation, multipath routing between hosts, and it offers trust information for end-to-end communication. The whole Scion project started back in 2009 in the group of Adrian Perrick in the context of studying security of interdomain routing protocols. And in the meantime, Scion is really already in production use by 7 internet service providers, and 5 more service providers have trial deployment. There are multiple independent implementations possible with Scion, both open source and closed source, and also not only possible, but also in use. And the project involves multiple components and stakeholders. As Brian already said, we had discussions, or Scion was discussed at last IETF in March. And as a consequence of this, we have now this meeting and also the informational draft, which here you find once more the link to it, and it is also on the bottom of this presentation. Just what we want to intend with this informational internet draft is offering an introduction into Scion and the motivation to develop Scion. And it is really only providing a very high-level description of Scion, its architectural components. We want it to serve as some kind of reference document that is that we do not have to explain Scion all the time to people, but really can refer to this document. And it should pave the way for further IETF work. But what it is really not meant, it is as input for really very in-depth technical discussions about the components and the protocol specification at this moment. So at this moment, this draft only hopes to, to help you explain what Scion is about and how it works on a high level. And all these technical discussions, in-depth technical discussions, will come with further internet drafts we would like to write about authentication and PKI infrastructure, how the control plane works and routing, about Scion data plane, also the security considerations and implications, and as well as we also want to provide a much more detailed CAP analysis. Then for all the people who didn't have the time to read the draft, I try to explain Scion in a nutshell. As I already told you, it is an interdomain path-based or path-aware network architecture. It is Scion organizes autonomous systems into so-called isolation domains. You can see them on the picture here. These are all isolation domains. Each isolation domain consists of a core, which has a couple of 2-3 autonomous systems, core autonomous systems, and then the rest of the isolation domain consists of like member autonomous systems. And each isolation domain can define its own roots of trust, which is defined in the so-called trust root configuration, which you see here in this graphic. And the purpose of this setup is it will allow trust heterogeneity, because each ISD can independently define its own roots of trust. And it also provides transparent trust relationships. Furthermore, it is possible, this setup makes it possible to isolate routing failures and misconfigurations. And it also improves scalability because it separates routing, inter isolation domain routing and intra isolation domain routing. Then the Scion control plane is in charge of the routing itself. It constructs, this is where the construction and the dissemination of path segments happens. And the control plane has its own PKI for authentication. Then there's also a Scion data plane, and this is in charge of the packet forwarding. So in the data plane, the path segments are combined into paths, and the packets contain this path information. The routers then forward packets based on this path information, and the Scion routers are simple routers which operate statelessly. If you have questions, please save them for after the presentation, because we have this discussion time to discuss anyway then. I shortly also want to show you what a Scion autonomous system in itself looks like. So this is an example of a Scion autonomous system. And then the Scion routers are at the borders of such an autonomous system. And their function is to pair with other Scion-enabled networks and to collect customer accesses. And they have to be able to communicate and to connect and link with other Scion-based networks or autonomous systems. But inside such an autonomous system, there is no need to change the internal network infrastructure. It can just be used as usual, as it is. And as I already said, there are already a lot of deployments working with Scion. First service providers in Switzerland, Europe, and also in Asia, and this number is growing. Then there's also an internet exchange point, SwissX, which offers Scion peering. The customers using Scion are financial institutions, can be found in education, government, healthcare. So this shows that is also really of use for institutions in different areas or companies. Then we have a research network which uses Scion to connect the Swiss institutions of the ETH domain. It's called Scion. And then there is the Scion Lab research testbed, where we test, for instance, future features before they are really getting into use. So now I come to the question why we think that the time is ripe to take Scion to the IETF and to standardize, to start maybe to kick off the standardization process. And this is first because there are more and more Scion deployments and implementations, and this also increases the need to have standards, to have a standardized implementation deployments. It is also demanded by early adopters because they want to have a standardized product. They don't want to have something which is going to change again and again. And of course, standardization will facilitate acceptance of science, and it also will prevent from talking past one another. So, I mean, it will prevent from that two parties speak of science but do mean something else, and it will ensure interoperability. Then another point is that we also would like to contribute to the discussion on path-aware networking, because this is, of course, a very important discussion, and because Scion is already in use and is deployed, we think we can really contribute our experiences to this discussion. Then there is a RFC 5218, which describes what it needs to be for a protocol to be successful. And it seems that we already fulfill these requirements. Like Scion does not have to be used by the entire internet to work. It supports incremental deployability. Then we know from the service providers and also the users who already use Scion that the benefits of deployment outweigh the costs. Then there are multiple portable implementations possible, both open and closed source. And one important point is also because Scion is already in use and deployed, we can show that it's not only a nice theory, but it really also works in practice. And the other thing which I already shortly mentioned is that we really hope that we can provide answers to questions raised in this RFC 9217 current open questions in path-aware networking. And of course, we cannot answer all the questions yet, but we think we can really, our experiences with Scion in deployments will be of great help to answer these questions. And we think we can already give some answers regarding the questions: how do endpoints get access to trustworthy path properties? How can they select trustworthy paths? How can you effectively operate a path-aware network in a path-aware internetwork? And how can you manage the transition from the current path-oblivious networking to path-aware networking? Yes, and we also have, of course, a goal with this, with the informational internet draft, and also with being part of this meeting. We hope that the draft in itself gets adopted by the PANRG group. And after, of course, implementing your feedback, we maybe in the end would like to get it published as an informational RFC, because then we can really refer to it. Like I already said, it is our intention to use it as a referential document. And then we also hope that we can, with this, kick off further IETF work and maybe start a possible standardization process. And what we think can be next steps from our point of view is then, of course, first address the comments and the feedback we get in this meeting. And then based on that, publish a new version of the internet draft before the next IETF, which will be in July in Philadelphia. And then based on how much feedback we get and how thorough it is, we after that might start the process of publishing the internet draft as an RFC, but we don't know, of course, when this moment will be there. Then parallel to this, we could already maybe start writing more technical internet drafts where we really talk about the protocols and the technical components, how it works, how Scion works in depth. And then also we hope that we also today already get an idea on how our way to go will be with at the IETF. So that is already, with this I already come to the end of my presentation, and I want to thank you for your attention. Brian?
Thank you very much. So the queue is open for questions.
Shall I stop the slide share?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Well, I mean, you might want to keep it up if there's anything in the slides you want to refer to for questions.
Okay, good.
Vincer, go.
Hi there. Thank you for coming and talking to us about this. I had two questions. One was you mentioned that you all had looked at the successful protocols RFC. I don't know if you all have looked at a RFC that PANRG has produced, came out relatively recently, called it's RFC 9049. And it's talking about obstacles to deployment. And this is this is the sad tale of woe that the IETF has had with path-aware protocols. And basically, it's kind of a list of what not to do. We've done a couple of exercises where we've looked at other protocols to see, well, we know where at least some of the landmines are, or is this protocol stepping on any of them? So that going through that might be a useful thing to do as well. Definitely answering research questions also. But I think both of those are good exercises to do, definitely.
Yeah, we actually did have a look at this RFC, and it's also mentioned in the internet draft. I just didn't include it in the slides. I should have done that maybe, but yes, we know about this RFC. Yes.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
And like I said, just making sure that everybody kind of has a common understanding of how, if you use that RFC as a filter, if there, if there are any things that get stuck in the filter as you're filtering, would be good to know too. Thank you.
Thank you.
The queue remains open.
Maybe briefly also to follow up on what Spencer said. I'm
yeah,
not
go for it.
sure. Can you hear me? Right. Yeah, absolutely. We looked at the draft at Spencer's RFC, the bestiary of roads not taken, with great interest, and we definitely, and unfortunately, I think we do tick the boxes and are able to avoid the pitfalls that are pointed out. And so that has been a very interesting and very useful document, actually.
So actually, I have a follow-up question on that one to put you on the spot a little bit, Adrian.
Right. Of course.
So from like 9049 and 9217, as well as sort of the what makes a successful protocol, from these three RFCs, which were basically written to sort of like give guidance in this space from operational wisdom that we've built through running the actual internet. Is there anything that might feed back into that, into sort of like future iterations of Scion development, or sort of like future things that you would do in terms of like further deployment of Scion beyond its current deployment?
Like you're looking for ways to supplement the document to say what is needed to be successful.
Right, or if there's anything that like basically came out of Spencer's document, for example, that's like, okay, hey, we hadn't thought about that. We do need to answer that question. You don't have to answer that question right now on video, but maybe in the next rev of the ID, that would be a good thing to address.
Right. Yeah, when I looked at it, it was a while ago, and it's I was more relieved that most of the things, most of the landmines, we magically were able to avoid without stepping into them.
It's not magic. You spend a lot of time thinking about it, right? Like,
so maybe it's a combination of luck and also having observed other protocols and systems.
Good. Eric, do you want me to do that at the microphone? Eric asked if there was a Scion interop or a developer table at the hackathon at 113. So in Vienna, was there any Scion participation at the hackathon there?
No, not yet.
Perhaps consider changing that for 114.
Right. So one of the requirements was that there is an active draft. And so now that we have that, we can actually now be at the hackathon. We looked at this in the past, and this was one of the requirements. So that's a great input.
Yeah. So I think now, like it's been a while since we've all been on airplanes. I think now the hackathon runs the week before Philadelphia. Do have a look at the like the logistics should be up. Make sure you show up on time, obviously, because it used to be just the weekend before, but then we found it was actually kind of useful to run it for longer, I believe, and I'm not sure I'm not sure how we're going to do that at Philadelphia. So,
right. Yeah. So Nicola will be there.
Oh, it's the weekend again, says Miria. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So maybe Nicola, that'll be something you can set up.
Cool. Suresh.
That's a good point. Thank you. I did have a question for you and Adrian as well. How do you see applications using this? Do you expect the applications to kind of natively hook onto this architecture? Are you looking for like proxies and gateways to stitch them together? Because I think that's the hardest part, and that has been for this multi-homing and all these like resilience proposals is the in-host support. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So Right now, all the customers actively using it, they use a translation system, a gateway, and that converts IP traffic into Scion traffic. And the opposite happens at the other end. But in research, we do have a number of different ways to have applications directly use Scion, of course. We have libraries that can support Scion. We're also looking at pure application level support so that the whole stack can be directly bundled with the application. And we have an auto discovery system that enables the system to detect if the local ISP offers Scion support, and then essentially turn on this stack and allow the application to directly use it. An interesting aspect also is to extend the happy eyeballs approach. I see Tommy is also online who has been driving this, and essentially adding Scion as a third option besides IPv4 and IPv6. And then yet another thing that we've looked at is also in the context of taps, where Brian and also Tommy have been very active in that space. And there's also has been actually insights that we had in Scion that already flowed into taps as well, to make use of the large number of potential paths that one could use.
And I know that in TAPS we
Perfect.
had a presentation from a master student who had done a Scion sort of TAPS bridge implementation, and sort of reported back to the working group on reflections on TAPS there. I don't know if that, I know how a lot of master student code, makes it into reality and how a lot of it doesn't. So I don't know if that's still maintained, but we did find that useful in the TAPS working group as well.
Hey, when was this, Brian? Was it done already, or is it something you're planning?
This was done a while ago. This was like about 3 years ago. So at least I know that the master student who did that has been working with me at Google for the past 3 years. So it was before that.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Brian. I'll contact you offline for points.
Dig through the minutes. Nicola, you have a question about Scion.
Yeah. Now I want to follow up on Suresh's question. At the moment, in the draft, we do not really describe too much in detail all those transition mechanisms that are a little bit more experimental and a little bit more on the research side. So I was wondering if for a next iteration of the draft, it would be a good idea to extend on that. And I'm talking about, for example, those mechanisms that Adrian mentioned, like, for example, perhaps extending happy eyeballs, all the auto-discovery mechanisms for Scion and hosts. But besides that, we also have other transitions mechanisms that are more transparent to end users, and they are also very briefly mentioned in the draft at the moment. We just didn't want to make it too heavy, but there's a lot of things going on, let's say, in research. I was just wondering how much it would be helpful to add more on that in this draft.
I think, like, this is my opinion as an individual, not as the chair. And then I'll say something as the chair. As an individual, I think the overview should probably stay an overview, but the other ways that you're looking at doing transition for a protocol transition like this should be their own documents. Now I'll put my chair hat on and say, as a member of the IRSG and the chair of a research group, when I hear someone talking about experimental transition methods to get a new protocol deployed, my ears peak up and I'm like, ooh, this is exactly the type of thing that we should be talking about in PANRG. So I think that, a deep exploration of those would make excellent sort of document within the research group. As well as sort of like the overview of saying, here's the framework for things. But I think that like digging into how you would actually run a transition like this is like, bread and butter for PANRG.
Sounds good, Brian. Thank you. Thanks, Nicholas.
So Miria is in queue.
Yes. So, I mean, talking about documents, and so I looked, I didn't read it fully, but I looked at the document, and it's a very well-written document, but it's not the kind of thing that I need in an internet draft. What I really need in the internet draft is protocol bits, which are currently not there. And especially what makes this discussion very hard is that, like, you present this as a whole system, and we try usually to look at building blocks. And what I see here is that you at least have 3 different parts here, which all need to work together. Which one is the kind of the trust system. The other one is the routing protocol, and the third one is a data plane. And I'm wondering how much it would be possible to separate those things, and also to rely maybe on existing protocols for parts of it. Like, why is the current key system not suitable for Scion? Or would there be a way to take the current key system or trust system and make it suitable to Scion, rather than developing an entirely own system, right? And the same, I think, is true for the data plane. There is a lot of work in the IETF in the area of segment routing, which is, like, from a protocol point of view, probably provides the same thing as you need. It provides you hops for routing information. So why is it not possible to take these existing protocols or adapt the existing protocols and integrate them into your system?
Right. So I think Corinne wanted to maybe answer about why we didn't have more protocol aspects. We wanted to, the idea was, and it would be good to discuss here, to keep the first draft short and as an overview, and then add additional pieces with the protocol details. Right. I think,
So
Corinne,
I think you, like, I don't want to be mean, but I think you failed in keeping it short. It's a quite rather long draft in IETF world, but anyway.
Okay. Yeah, that's the usual problem, but there is a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover. And if you think there should be more of a hierarchy, keeping even shorter. And
so the point is, I think it's a very well written document, right? And it provides a lot of useful information and also answers to some of the questions I have. It's just like, this is nothing that we would standardize. This would never be an RC at the end.
No.
So the question stays, what's the parts that we need to standardize?
Right.
But,
So
yeah.
Mhm.
No,
Go
I
ahead,
think
Anna.
it was also not the intention to that it will be a standard. You know, it's really like information.
No, this is fine. I'm not criticizing this draft. Not every draft has to be a standard, but this is the question we need to answer, right? At the end, we need to understand what the parts that need standardization, how they look like, in order to figure out where to put it and how to help you.
Yeah, I think that's also really also the question we try to answer in this meeting, I guess.
Yeah. I think let's actually come back to that question at the next steps part. Thank you, Miri, for bringing that up. But, like,
yeah, so the
let's
part
come
that
back
I'm
to that at the
definitely
next
also
bit.
missing, I'm happy to come back to that, but I'm
Yes.
also missing is really, like, why, first of all, do you need everything together, or is there an option to, like, standardize only parts of it for the start? And also, why do you need a new protocol rather than adopting existing protocols in some space? Or is there actually an option for, like, an intermediate step to use existing protocols?
Right. So one thing you mentioned is also segment routing. Why don't we use that as the data plane? Maybe we can quickly cover it now, and then later we can come back if needed. And segment routing, we've definitely looked at that, since it's also, there's already a fair amount of implementation of it in existing products. And so it's a very attractive way to do the data plane. But in Scion, there's additional security mechanisms that protect the fields in the data plane. And these cryptographic identifiers are not present in segment routing. And also I think it can play very well together, more to add segment routing headers to also obtain intra-domain guarantees, whereas Scion mostly provides the inter-domain guarantees, the links between the different autonomous systems. And so combining the two, and then Scion has the cryptographic aspects to protect the policies of the paths, the entities that created the paths, would then play nicely together with the more trustworthy environment of intra-domain that is then not cryptographically protected. I think the
Yes,
two actually.
I mean, I think what you should do is, rather than saying, and I mean, I'm not an expert in segment routing, and there are many opinions in that space and so on. So, not sure if I give you the best advice. But I think what you should do is, rather than looking at segment routing or any other IETF protocol and say this doesn't fit our needs, it's rather figuring out how you can adopt the protocol, how you can add something to the protocol in order to make it fit your needs, or how can you reuse existing building blocks, because that will be much easier path forward in the IETF.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was definitely a consideration. But in the end, it's really also the efficiency, right, of having only 12 bytes per AS that's being traversed was an important consideration. Because otherwise, if you have a number of ASs and you're having too many bytes for per AS, your header will become too large as well. And so for inter-domain, you have to be very, very careful not to have things blow up in your face, especially when you use crypto. And so you want to make sure things are very compact.
Yeah, I mean, when I started as an academic researcher, that's kind of my first lesson learned, that not always the best and optimized solution is the thing that will get standardized, because there are a lot of considerations about the ability for people to understand your system is, for example, easier if your changes are smaller, right? And the chance to get this deployed or implemented correctly are also higher. So there's like a lot of more considerations. And at the end, not always the optimal solution, whatever you would see in your research as the best solution, is the one that gets standardized for various reasons. So I don't think that should be the aim. The aim should be to get something standardized that is accepted, deployable, and understood by the community.
That's definitely understood, right? Thank you.
Nicola, did you want to follow up on this point, or
Yeah.
I've got two questions from the chat that I could bring.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up on this point, since we also did not touch PKI. I mean, one of the things that makes Scion also different from, let's say, segment routing is that Scion has its own trust model, right, with all these isolation domains and so on. So the design is really based on the assumption that you're trying to connect entities that do not necessarily trust each other, and I think that is one of the things that makes it very different from segment routing, where you basically trust everyone in your intra-AS domain. And for example, looking at the RFC 1949, the one about obstacles to deployment, you do see that a lot of inter-domain extensions or protocols actually failed exactly because of this this gap in the trust model. When you have, let's say, control messages that are not authenticated, or whenever you have entities that you do not trust, then it becomes a lot more difficult to implement mechanisms like segment routing. And this is why Scion is a bit more different than existing protocols, and that is because it tries to address those many of those concerns with the trust model. But of course, that comes at a compromise, in the sense that some things, for example, the data plane is a bit of its own because of what Adrian mentioned. So having cryptography and so on. I hope that that adds up, just a bit more input on your question, Miriam. I'm done.
Colin, on this point.
Hi, yeah. I mean, just to follow up on this point, I think it's easy to get stuck in the specifics of particular proposals, and I suspect Miriam's point wasn't so much about segment routing and more about the there's a very big system being proposed here. There's a lot of pieces to Scion, and I think we're trying to see how it can be brought in, maybe how the pieces can be separated, and understand which ones are ready for standardization, and what's the right approach to standardizing that, and which pieces what places there are still open research questions.
So,
So I think rather than focusing on specific topics, it's how should we approach bringing this work in to some combination of the PANRG in IRTF or potentially some IETF groups.
So I think we're already kind of going into the next steps discussion, but I did have two questions from the chat that I wanted to pose before we continue this. So I will put myself in queue before Spencer. Eric Klein asks, is it easy for developers and tinkerers to play with it natively? Parenthesis, I went looking for an ether type on the IANA page, and I'm assuming that trails off into I didn't find one. So how easy is it to get started? Like, I'm a hobbyist. I have some computers and some switches and, some stuff in the cloud. How easy is it to get started playing around with Scion?
So I'll take this one. For playing around, I think the best way is to use Scion Lab, which is our research and development network. I think there was a link into the slide. The website is scionlab.org, and you can register, and then you can, from the website, you can already download all the Scion configuration to attach your own device, where you then get all the software packages to run Scion natively. So that means that you can really choose the path and so on. So I think that's the easiest way. There is no ether type, because especially in this scenario, basically this runs as on top of IP. That's just because of in order to make it easier. But having an ether type could be potentially one of the open questions for a later point in time.
That is not a question for this room, but yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
and then Ralph Giles asked basically a follow-up question to that. What is the status of direct kernel driver support? The only code I've found seems to be oriented toward tunneling. So Scion in the kernel.
I'm not aware. I'm not sure if Adrian, you're aware of something, but I don't think we are at that level yet.
Okay. Now I will remove myself from the queue and allow Spencer to ask a question.
We moving to the next part of the conversation yet?
Let me stall on that and say, are there any other people that have sort of like questions about what Scion is, or what, how, or shall we go ahead and say that we have finished the Q&A and go into the next steps discussion? So I will leave the queue open for 20 seconds on that and see if anybody is going to rush to the queue or put something in the chat, and then we can flip the bit. And I will take over the slides. Actually, hold on, let me do this. And move us on to the next steps discussion. I did a little bit of brainstorming before this and figured out, what I think the next steps are. Obviously, there's, the question that's being asked in the presentation. Do we want to adopt this overview as a research group draft? I think I've heard one very good idea for a research group draft, looking at sort of like the experimentation for different transition mechanisms, right? Like we talked about, sort of like the user space, UDP, data plane encapsulation that would allow you to just compile the Scion stack directly into an application. That sounds super useful. Tunneling approaches, ways to transition from tunneling to native. I think there's been a lot of work done by the Scion folks in this area that would be, super useful to have in the research group, just to sort of generalize that knowledge, if nothing else. That could lead to my second point, larger scale experiments with Scion sort of within the auspices of the research group. It's like there's the Scion lab. Is there some sort of like cooperation or venue arrangement with a research group where we could sort of like foster larger scale experimentation. I don't know. Is there, a way that this work could be a conduit for parts of Scion? And I think that, Miria raised a really good question, parts, let's put parts in bold and italic here, of Scion into appropriate IETF working groups. But like, I'm just the chair. I'm just here to use Meet Echo poorly. So if you have ideas here for next steps, please enter the queue, but you'll have to go after Spencer. Spencer.
I have a few things, and please cut me off if I have more than a few things.
We've got 70 minutes at this point. Please don't use it all, but I think we got plenty.
No, if you see people dropping out of the Meet Echo, flag me down also.
I'm watching the numbers.
and someone should. So first thing, we were talking about different docs. There was a suggestion that Miria was making, if I understood it correctly. I wanted to agree with that suggestion for several reasons. I'd like to talk about a couple of the reasons. So one of the things that is worth thinking about is what's the level of maturity of the different pieces that make up Scion. And the question that, is basically how much has this been deployed? How much has this been, how much experience do we have with it? How stable has it been? Where it doesn't have to be all the same level of maturity to move forward, right? So the question you're really asking is what's research and what's engineering? What's research that we don't actually know how to do yet, or do well, or do at internet scale yet, and what's engineering? There have been a number of protocols that have come through the IRTF, and the one I'm thinking of specifically is HIP, where there was a HIP research group and a HIP working group at the same time, where the research group takes the hard parts, which at the time for them, that was basically finding other endpoints that are speaking HIP, because the hits are not hierarchical. So, like finding the other people, that was harder, but doing the data, basically doing the protocol itself was engineering. So we've even had two, a research group and a working group that were working on the same different parts, aspects of the same protocol. And that was a lot about maturity and things like that. If we're talking about moving forward, at least some stuff moving forward into the IETF. Okay, that's one of the things I understood that was on the table. A question I asked a lot of people over a bunch of years who had proposals like Scion is to ask people to say, what are the protocols that you're reusing? What protocols are you extending? And what protocols are you inventing? And that turned out to be a kind of important question for a lot of proposals. And I think this is back again to Miria's thing, basically saying, if you say, well, we're not going to reuse segment routing, at least that, that's the going in position right now. So explaining why Scion doesn't reuse the existing protocols could be really important for the other protocols, but I think it will also be important for your protocol because you'll almost certainly be asked that repeatedly. So having a good answer that all the authors agree on would be, and is written down someplace would be great. The one other thing, just to mention this. So there's a RFC 7418 that this is not what it started out to be, but it kind of turns out to be a good place to explain the difference between what's going into the IETF and what's going into the IRTF. And my understanding is that Colin still largely agrees with what's in that RFC about that, what that relationship might look like. And that actually feeds into my final point, which is please don't try to do all of this yourself, all the moving forward yourself and figuring out yourself. Ask for feedback, and PANRG is a really pretty good place for people to ask for feedback about how things move forward. It has a lot of people with a lot of experience, and I'm seeing at least 2 current ISG area directors in the MeetEcho now. So, this is actually a good, safe place to have those discussions before you get to submitting a BOF request and writing everything down for what will kind of tend to be an up-down vote. I did have one more, which is related to that. Fate sharing in IETF proposals. So basically, doing what Miria was saying, where you say, well, there's 3 or 4 different parts of this. If you put them in as the Scion BOF request, they're all going to either move forward or not. So saying, if I have these different parts, how many of them are separable? They may not be able to be separable, and they would have to go forward together. Any 2 of them would have to move forward together, but that might not be true. So you might be able to move some stuff forward if it's useful on its own, without waiting for the hardest parts to move forward. And that was the last thing I was going to say.
Cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, I apologize if you can hear me furiously typing there, but I'm trying to get all of this feedback to put into the minutes so that we can pass it on to the Scion folks. But I see Adrian is on mic, as is Corinne. So
I just
if you'd like to say something to that, please go ahead. And they both muted themselves.
I just wanted to thank Spencer for his feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really great feedback.
Yeah,
I've been furiously typing that down. I will send it to Spencer to make sure that I didn't miss anything before we post the minutes there. Nicola.
Yeah, and regarding that feedback, we were indeed thinking about having a more in detail gap analysis draft, really trying to look at what is existing and what Scion can add and why the existing cannot be reused. So I'm thinking loudly that this might be a way to clarify this. It's just that within this draft, we initially started thinking to add a bit more about that, but it is just too much. So could that be a way to make this a bit more clear if we focus on a gap analysis draft and looking at what is existing?
I think we'd probably have to read the gap analysis draft to give a clear yes, no, but seems like.
Of course. Yeah.
There's another thing that I've heard said, I think Miria said it first here, that I want to try and rephrase, sort of pick out also from Miria and what Miria said and what Spencer said is there's this question of fate sharing and separability. And I think it's a really good exercise, possibly in that gap analysis draft, to say, okay, what happens if we standardize just the PKI and we use the current PKI or the Scion PKI with the current internet IPv6 protocol stack, segment routing maybe in a couple of places, and BGP, right? It's like we just changed the PKI. And what if we say, okay, we have the current internet PKI, the current RPKI, the current DNS security model, and the current sort of IPv4, IPv6 dual stack, but we add the path discovery and the beaconing, and we say, okay, well, we'll cheat and we'll be able to add the security of the path discovery. So you basically get, better than BGP-SEC, but none of the other stuff changes. What does that look like? Or then you say, and I think this is the one that makes the least sense, but it might be worth doing for completeness. What happens if we standardize the Scion data plane, but with BGPAS numbers and the current PKI? I don't think that one makes a lot of sense on its own, but and that actually might be input to a discussion about which of these things do you standardize first, right? I mean, which of these things, and I don't have a real good feeling of the PKI and the path discovery and path exposure and sort of the new routing paradigm. I don't have a really good feeling of which of those is most indispensable on its own. And I think a gap analysis that also explored these things separately would be super interesting and super useful. Right, because I want to underscore again with my chair hat on here, right? Like, so Scion is an example of trying to do a wholesale replacement of a running architecture, which there was NCP to TCP IP in 1980 whatever, and you could say that maybe that was that level of wholesale architecture change, but I don't think it's even that big. We've never done this before. This is an example of trying to do that. There are generalizable insights that can come out of trying to do this as well. And I think those are, 100% PANRG material. With that, Tommy.
Okay, is this working?
It is working.
Woohoo! Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, thanks for bringing this to the IETF and writing up the ID. I, largely agreeing with Spencer and Brian and Miria on what they've said. I just wanted to chime in with a suggestion maybe for how we could approach the analysis work based on what I've been hearing here. So as we've mentioned, and as I think the draft does refer to, we have all of these cases where the path-aware networking didn't work. And that's very useful. And, what I'm hearing from you guys and from Adrian, and I believe it, this is a model that is path-aware. We actually have some deployment experience in some real networks that are using this. And we think, yeah, this one actually works. And so it's like, oh, we actually have a positive example now. So I think at the very least, learning from this example of what makes this work and the other ones didn't work is a useful thing to do. And personally, I'd like to more figure out how can we evolve the existing protocols as much as possible and not just have like, here's a divergent stack that you need to switch over to something that's not the normal internet to get path-aware networking. But I think at this point, I don't know if we can answer the question of, can we do that correctly? And so, digging in to answer that question would be useful. And essentially look at all of the different properties and figure out, what do you think makes Scion different from the previous attempts to do path-aware networking that didn't work? And start maybe with those properties as like, these are the kind of the fundamental properties that are going to make this work. And then once we have those properties, figure out, okay, here's the property. Can we add that or find it in an existing internet protocol? Or, can we evolve it? Or do we actually have the analysis to say that, this particular piece of the existing internet protocol cannot do that and cannot be easily evolved. And so we do need to switch that piece out for something. But, start with the principles that we think will make it succeed rather than just pointing out, oh, here's the gap analysis of the internet and poking holes at that, because I think we see that and sometimes that doesn't go as well. But starting from, this is what we think is making this successful, where are those properties shared in existing protocols? Where can they be added, or where do they need to be replaced? I think that would help a lot of us understand what pieces we need to take, what pieces we don't, and maybe we'll make it easier for people to come into the conversation without being scared by big new architecture.
That is great
Thank you,
input.
also.
So definitely we can take it in consideration for this additional gap analysis.
Right. Those are great points. We took note. So definitely.
Brian, are you on mute or?
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I was like furiously typing notes and muted myself and then completely forgot. So Miria brought a point to the chat that I actually wanted to raise up to the to the room. This time with a microphone that is on. Documenting deployments, e.g., with gateways and experiences and challenge with that is going to be more interesting than just documenting the architecture. And I would underscore that. I think that we have seen a lot. Within PANRG, we've seen a lot of proposals, some complete, some incomplete, about parts of the path awareness puzzle. What Scion has that none of those other ones have is like actual deployment experience. And I think that all of us can learn from that deployment experience. So something that's really kind of an implementation report of we can read the stuff in the papers of what worked. I'd be more interested in the stuff that's not publishable elsewhere, right? So it's very, very difficult to publish negative results. What did Scion try as part of trying to get, this experimental internet architecture to the point of deployment that didn't work? That I think would also be an interesting input to the research group. And I was largely talking to Phil. Well, somebody joined you. Excellent. Corinne, go ahead.
Can I ask my question?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. So this extended gap analysis and also describing what works or what did not work, or what did Scion do different. What kind of document should that be then? Like an informational internet draft or
that would be like an informational internet draft of the research group. Yes.
Sorry,
that would be an informational internet draft of the research group. Basically, just sort of like an implementation report. Here are things that we tried. Here are like the paths that we found were not useful, and then it would be super interesting within the RG to compare those to sort of like Spencer's draft. Are there any gaps that we missed in Spencer's analysis of things that happened in the IETF that happened in the Scion story because of because Scion is different, right?
Okay, good, thanks.
It sounds like we're giving you a whole bunch of internet drafts to write, but let's see if there's yes. So Colin, you're next.
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting discussion, and we're doing the thing which I think research groups do a lot, which is diving into where the interesting research areas are, and I think that that's cool, right? I mean that's what we want from a point of view of a research group, is to figure out what's the open research questions here. I mean, obviously there's the bigger question of Scion as a system and how we approach bringing the whole thing in, and if we should bring the whole thing in, I think there's obviously a bunch of interest in it. There's clearly a bunch of good ideas in Scion. There's clearly a bunch of good deployment experience in it, and I think that's something which bits of this, that this group has been missing, and in places. I think sort of circling back to some of the earlier points, though, Scion is a system, and it's a large system, and the IETF isn't really good at systems with a capital S. It's good at components and pieces. I think, sort of coming back to some of that earlier discussion, we should be thinking about which bits we can bring into the IRTF and what makes sense as deployment experience and all of these things. And I think that's all really good. But we should also be thinking about which bits make sense to potentially say, that's not research anymore, that should go talk to the IETF, and which bits we're saying, this component of the system is not yet well enough defined, and we need to refine the design and do some more research to make it perhaps scalable to the internet, or to solve whatever issues we see in there. So, again, I'm sort of putting in a plea to think about what are the components and what are their relative maturity levels, as well as just what experience do we have from using the system as a whole.
You're muted, Brian.
Suresh. Thank you.
I was trying to read your lips. I was trying to read your lips and say, like, hey, did you say like Suresh speak or not? So, but
Suresh. Yeah, it's hard to, yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I was kind of thinking, like, it's my engineering brain on like a little bit, right? Like, so how does this like work on the interoperability stuff, right? Right now we're looking at like one reference implementation, more or less, right? Like everything coming out of ETH, kind of like at a basic level. So like, how does like somebody build an interoperable gateway implementation on some other side, right? I think that was something that needs to get documented. And also another thing I couldn't figure out was the versioning, right? Like, everything is version 0.0. So what happens if there's like version 0.1 gets stepped up, and how do they talk to each other, right? Especially if somebody else is implementing it. I thought that needs to get into a draft somehow, right? Like, talking about like, more implementation consideration that nails like kind of a little bit dovetails into like what Media was saying as well. Like, maybe we haven't seen these issues, right? It's not really what issues have you experienced, but it's also what issues you might experience going forward.
I think the versioning one is a really, really good point, because we have figured out so many ways to do that wrong in the IETF, and are working. There's active work right now in the transport area where we're trying something that might be right, but we don't know yet, right? So, yeah, I think that does like +1 to Suresh on both those points.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure if Suresh, if you had a look at our documentation, but also there we have to, we have in the plan to be a little better at that. Right now we have versioning for the, let's say, open source implementation. But that's definitely a good point from a protocol level as well. One thing to mention about that is that when it comes to the cryptography or parts of the cryptography, Scion allows to eventually replace some of the mechanisms there. So that's something that we would eventually describe once we go to the low-level bits. But in general, this is a very good input. We'll keep it in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikhil.
I think that the algorithm and cipher agility in the crypto side of things is probably the most important thing to get right, because like in the worst case, you can just encrypt everything else and then nobody can, you don't have the on-path problem. But like in general, because you are basically encrypting certain information for certain devices on path, you still have to make sure you sort of have the minimum profile, right? Like, because there's the minimum profile problem. I mean, like, these are all sort of relatively well understood problems, but like, we need to make sure we have sort of answers for those and that those are documented. Leaving the queue open for other people on next steps, and then I will take my read from the chair and then ask Colin to correct me as the IRTF chair. But I think there's a lot of good points here. I will work a little bit this evening and tomorrow to get the minutes together. Hello, Spencer. Go ahead.
Always count on me. So I think my understanding of what we're saying is that most of the feedback is how to move this forward, not trying to talk ourselves out of moving things forward. And I think that that's an important thing for us to take away if it's true. But I mean, this is what I'm hearing. If other people are hearing other things, that might be useful to know. Thank you.
I'm willing to be like convinced otherwise on this point, but as a chair, I'm not sure I want to take the is this a terrible idea and should we go away with it? Not because, I'm afraid of the result either way, but because I think there is, like, what I'm hearing is there are questions that we know that we need to be answered in order to make that determination, and we don't have the answers to those yet, right? Like, so what I'm hearing is a lot of people pointing at this gap analysis document and say, I want the gap analysis document, but recognizing that the term gap analysis for that document is was not that accurate when we started talking about it, and through sort of the amendments that have been made in this discussion is completely inaccurate at this point. Yeah, I see that I'm actually kind of making the point that Mary made in the chat. If you can honestly identify existing components you can adopt, potentially extend and reuse, that makes it starting the new work much easier. It's not about the gaps, it's about like the parts to reuse and how to extend them. And I think there's also the suggestion of like, what does it look like if we split this apart and only do one? I think that's another good way to approach that question. Spencer.
Yeah, and I agree with the characterization of what a gap analysis should be versus what it could be. And we would definitely hope for one that was what it should be. The one thing I would say about that is that's an IETF, my opinion, that's an IETF step that if you don't have that before you go to the IETF with something, you're going to have a bunch of long conversations with people who are going to be asking the same question over and over in different venues. So I think that that's a useful thing for people to do before they go to the IETF with some part of this work. So maybe another interesting thing to do is to say how much of what is separable.
Yep.
Miriam was talking about like 3 lumps. How many lumps do the Scion people think there are or should be? And we might even find that other people can look at those and say part of that is separable, and part of that is separable from everything in this lump, and so we could look at that separately and potentially propose it separately. One thing that's also good to say is we have a lot of experience with pieces of things that go into different IETF working groups, maybe even in different areas. Right.
Yep.
So basically the decomposition and saying, how many pieces are really involved here is going to be something that's going to be really useful. And I think that I'm sorry. I think that I think that that's a really useful thing to do. So anyway,
yeah.
Thank you.
So I think there is actually a question that I want to, and you can see that I was trying to figure out how to use the show of hands tool. I think there is a question that I would like to pose to the people in this room right now about this sort of this composition, decomposition component. I'm not sure the word of it, but like this document that we started talking about is a gap analysis. You made a really good point earlier that I think with both my hats on, agree with. That PANRG is an excellent venue to get the kind of feedback to hone that analysis. And I think the question that I want to ask then is, does the research group believe that that is a useful thing to work on in the RG and a useful product of the RG? And yeah, so, okay, I dismissed it, but I didn't end the session, so I've already started it. So does it make sense to bring the Scion composition analysis into PANRG? Raise for yes, do not raise for no. And I'll leave that open for another 30 seconds or so. So I'm seeing 16 hands, 12 yay, 4 nay, which is I'm going to interpret as a pretty good signal that we should ask the Scion folks to send us that document and then collaborate, like send us an initial draft of that document with a view toward collaborating on that in PANRG. So that is one concrete outcome of this. I think that's the next step. Corin, do you have a question on that, or?
Yes, just a bit about the timeline, because
Yes.
July might be, I think we have to really deep into this, and July might be too early maybe, but I think we are also not in a hurry maybe.
Yeah, I would suggest start thinking about it. And like we have a long tradition of like 0.0 documents being, very much works in progress. And I would see this as something where the collaboration would continue within the research group. So it's okay if what you have is a starting point with, to-do scribbled on it, and we can discuss from there in Philadelphia. Spencer, are you still in queue?
Okay, thanks.
Oh,
I can't click on anything while you were taking a poll. I'm sorry, and then I got distracted.
okay, cool. I would like to ask another question. If anyone who raised their hand that know this doesn't make sense in PANRG would like to talk about why. I'm assuming that's not Colin because he was already in queue.
I was already in the queue. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that previous point you made, and that Corinne made. This sort of, I'm not sure gap analysis is the right word, but let's use gap analysis.
It's really not, yes.
Discussion. I'm not sure that necessarily has to be a document initially. It certainly could be, but I read the sort of conversation we've been having as more of, the group has a bunch of interest in talking about this topic. And maybe that will result in a concrete document that goes forward. Maybe it will be a bunch of discussions, and then based on that discussions, we refine the idea of how the work should be approached, and then come up with a different plan for a sort of concrete documents, some of which maybe goes to the IETF, some of which comes into this research group or whatever. So I kind of read it more as understanding the problem space rather than necessarily writing a document ready for publication.
No, I like that. So like I would say then I'll go with what Colin said. not necessary to have a document before Philadelphia. Please do come to Philadelphia prepared to talk about those questions, because I think we'll definitely put some time on the agenda to dig into that. Does that sound reasonable / make sense, Corinne et al.?
Yes, well, I cannot come to Philadelphia, but we can of course prepare.
Oh,
I can of course.
I
prepare
probably I'll be chairing it, and I won't be in Philadelphia either, most probably. So yeah, we can, the time zone kind of works. We'll try to set it up so that it's like, I think the last meeting's at like 10 p.m. In Zurich.
So you mean
because the 6 hour
would
test.
more be like preparing a presentation again where we
It'd be preparing a presentation, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just worth mentioning that like 3/4 of the people in IETF 113 were remote. So it's really okay if you're not in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Yeah. It's my holiday. That's yeah. But okay, I see what I can do. Yeah.
Nicola was in, or
Oh yeah, just some of us will be there anyways. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We'll definitely we'll circle back internally, and maybe we'll think if we have enough to just send a very early draft anyways, or if we just open up a discussion. I think
but
we'll
definitely bring people ready to have a discussion. Whether those people are on site or not is less important, because there will be, it'll be a hybrid meeting, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm planning on attending the meeting. I'm planning on co-chairing the meeting. I'm not currently planning on being in Philadelphia. As a case in point. So yeah, and then if there's enough there, it makes sense to put it into a doc. But like I think the main directive to y'all is come prepared to continue this discussion there with like a directly talking about what does it look like if we decompose this? What are the implications if we do just one thing? What are the existing protocols that we could conceivably adapt or evolve? What are the barriers to that? I think you might find in some cases like, yeah, this is not perfect, but it's okay enough that if it gets us over having to switch the entire world over to a new system at once, it reduces, reduces the barriers to adoption in the IETF. But I think what's more important is reducing the barriers to adoption of the technology, right? Like, so, if it's easier to deploy because it's like, hey, it looks like something that we already have experience with, that's a huge win, right?
Thank you.
Miria.
Yeah, I think I'm not saying anything new, but I just wanted to underline this point that a draft doesn't have to be like a final paper or whatever. It's just like writing down information that people need for the discussion. So it can be useful to have something written down that people can read before the meeting and can prepare, but it doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be complete or anything like that. So yeah.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, thanks for the input.
And Colin, as the IRTF chair, to close the discussion.
Sure.
I was about to ask you to come up and do that anyway. So,
well, you'd almost think we had a secret back channel. Yeah, I mean, the conclusion I'm taking away from this is that there's a bunch of people who are interested in the ideas, and I think Spencer said earlier, it's not. The feedback is how to move this forward, not should we move this forward. I think there seems to be a general view, and I think I agree with this, that the IETF is not good at taking large systems on. It's good at taking a bunch of components which can be assembled into a large system. And understanding that the pieces that are part of the Scion system and how to approach approach taking the different pieces and which ones are ready for standardization and which ones are there's more research open seems to be the key thing going forward. So yeah, I think identify the components, figure out which ones can be adopted, which ones can be potentially extended and reused, and make the starting point, which bits of Scion are ready for standardization now, which bits are potentially less mature and need more thinking about. Understand the pieces, and then we can then figure out how to move the pieces forward rather than trying to approach this as one whole thing that needs to be standardized. And I think I agree that this group is a reasonable place to have that discussion about understanding the pieces.
Okay, so what I'm taking away is chairs is there's basically two action items. There's one action item for the Scion folks to come prepared to talk about what I'm going to call a component analysis, right? Like, so it's really about what are the components of this system? How are those components similar to existing parts of the internet architecture? What happens if you deploy only one of them components? What are the possible, if less than optimal, parts of the current internet architecture and the internet protocol stack that could be adapted to replace the missing components of the Scion system if you only deployed one or two of them? I think, that's a fair amount of work. And I would say that the action item is come prepared to start that discussion at IETF 114. I also heard an action item for the chairs to schedule significant time for this discussion at PANRG and IETF 114, and also be prepared to schedule additional interim meetings, because I do want to have some time on the agenda for call for open topics at the IETF meeting, but like interims are cheap, right? And I think we found today this was a very productive interim, and I think that we can, especially if we have parts of this discussion sort of in the wider audience, like today there were like 34 people peak in the room. There's usually in the pandemic times, there were 80 to 90 coming into the PANRG in person. Pre-pandemic times. And I think a model where we basically are sort of like exposing what's coming out of that discussion there and then like continuing it in interims could work quite well. We'll figure out what interim schedule makes the most sense. We want to do one or two between the IETFs, but I think that we'll do nothing in terms of scheduling an interim before 114, and then prepare to sort of like continue the discussion between Philadelphia and London. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And then hopefully by the time of the November meeting, we'll have a pretty good idea how to approach this. And
I think that's a realistic time frame. I like that too. And then we can have and then prepare for, I guess the next one's in San Francisco. Like anything that comes out of this that then is like, IETF ready would be San Francisco. That seems like a realistic timeline. Okay.
Excuse me, when is it in San Francisco?
That's March of 2023.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I believe that brings us to the end of our agenda, unless anyone has any other business for the Path-Aware Networking Research Group. Going once.
Not sure your timeline of IETF meetings is right, but yes. Other than that,
okay. Yes. I know there's one in San Francisco at some point, but yeah, like the one after London is the one that we'd be targeting for.
London +1. I just wanted to thank the chairs for scheduling this interim. This was terrifically productive.
Thank you very much. Happy to have been of service.
Yeah, I also want to thank you for organizing this meeting, and also for at least having an idea of what we can do next. And then, I hope we can come up with something interesting for the next IETF.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So Miria points out in the chat that the March is in Asia, and then the July is San Francisco. So we'd be targeting the March meeting, not the July meeting for the
What
earliest
shall I do
possible.
with the draft we already submitted? Just leave it for now.
Yeah, let's leave it for now. I think that we can take discussion points on the list or any feedback for updating it. I think it actually does make sense as a draft, like an individual draft targeted at PANRG right now, like with the draft decoder PANRG, it shows up in PANRG's document list as a targeted document.
Okay.
I think it's a good sort of background for people who are going to contribute to that sort of composition, and how would we bring something like this in the IETF discussion. It's good sort of base reading. I think we would make a determination later as a research group as to whether we want to publish it as an RFC, or if I think that where we're probably going to get is whatever document comes out of that component analysis makes more sense to publish, because there are also sort of generalizable principles that we can pull out of that.
Okay.
So yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I will hopefully tomorrow, possibly Monday, send out minutes for the meeting. I have collections of notes that I took, and we'll post those to the list as well. And also to Karin, Nicola, and all Scion folks, it's not that we're expecting sort of a fully formed presentation and idea to appear at the Philadelphia meeting. If there's anything that you're working on that you have questions on or need or want feedback on, please do not hesitate to post that to the PANRG list, right? That's what the list is there for.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, thanks.
And equally reach out to either myself or to the PANRG chairs if there are questions.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you additionally to all of the participants. This was I don't want to say surprisingly productive meeting. But I will say I think we got farther into a better place than I was hoping to get today. So thank you very much for the discussion. I think we got a really good sort of strong signal on what to do next, and let's get to work. Thanks a lot, everyone, and I will see you in not Philadelphia. Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.